Hello, this is Aaron Tovish. I'm coming to you from the beautiful city of Stockholm, although I wish I could be with you there in New York. I have written a talk which I will now give, the text of which will be available on the internet soon. I'm dealing with NATO, first use, no first use, and the Non-Proliferation Treaty. A relic of the early decades of the Cold War, threats to initiate nuclear warfare persist for no good reason and for several bad ones. Their renunciation would enhance security and build confidence for the establishment of a nuclear weapon-free world. The use of gas and germ weapons was first prohibited, after which they were eliminated. So why not that progression with nuclear weapons? Well, it's a sad story. After prolific use during World War I, gas and germ weapons were not used among the belligerent nations during World War II, thanks in large part to the Geneva Protocols against such use, as well as the retention of arsenals to deter use. If nuclear weapons had been developed in the interwar period, without a doubt, they would have been included in the protocols. Instead, they were developed in wartime. It was falsely claimed that atomic bombs had brought World War II to an end. But anyway, there were so few of them, why not just eliminate them? Indeed, the first UN General Assembly resolution in January 1946 called for the elimination of all weapons adaptable to mass destruction. However, as East-West tensions heightened at its founding, NATO enshrined first-use options in its defense doctrine. The NATO Pact followed suit. Many atomic scientists regretted their role creating a weapon of mass destruction. Some, led by Hans Bethe, saw a potential silver lining. Fear of nuclear escalation would motivate nations not to make war at all. Thus, NATO's threat to initiate war might be a good way to prevent conventional war. Scientists even helped to develop a new nuclear weapon that would make nuclear escalation seem more credible. In the 1950s, the Soviet Union could not match the nuclear forces of NATO. It was highly credible that if faced with the prospect of NATO use, Russia would back off. NATO had what was called escalation dominance. However, by the 1970s, neither side could claim such dominance. This ought to have led to the renunciation of nuclear escalation threats. Why didn't it? Rather than jettisoning first-use options, futile efforts were made to increase its credibility. More usable nuclear weapons were developed. One, the neutron bomb, was actually rejected. Elaborate plans for their employment were prepared and practiced. The land-based weapons were forward deployed. Becoming vulnerable to a use it or lose it predicament made it seem more likely that they would be resorted to in a crisis. Expensive military exercises involving escalation to nuclear warfare were conducted on a regular basis. Top officials took part in them, for example, the Able Archer exercises. Thus, the extended deterrence offered non-nuclear weapon states NATO allies became seen as synonymous with the first use policies, not just nuclear retaliation in kind. Despite the inherent lack of credibility, this has attained the mythical status of the glue that holds NATO together. Russia was also heavily invested in first use options. It mirrored many of NATO's actions, including planning, deployments, and exercises. This served to keep its Warsaw Pact allies dependent upon their nuclear armed partner. If Russia called NATO's bluff, NATO would call its, and vice versa. So neither called. You had a form of mutually assured deception. This survived even the end of the Cold War, and now Russia is exploiting it to the hilt, as in saber rattling. Even though NATO leaders know better, Western media unwittingly amplifies Russia's threats, and the general public comes to expect counter threats to be made. Note that it is China, consistent with its no first use policy, which is regularly telling Russia to stop making nuclear threats. If it's all bluffs, then what's the worry? Yes, the worry is exaggerated, but that doesn't mean the whole nonsense is harmless. In fact, bluff escalation is dangerous. Every step taken to increase credibility heightens the risk of inadvertent nuclear weapon use. A recent example of this is the conventional bombardment of a Ukrainian target by Russia using an intermediate range ballistic missile designed to deliver nuclear warheads. Aware of the risk on this occasion, Russia gave advance warning of the attack. The greatest danger is that the bluff escalation contributes to crisis escalation, and at some point your adversary might begin to wonder whether they ought to believe your threats. If that adversary has a first use policy, you now need to have to worry about them beating you to the punch. Furthermore, you can surmise that they have the same worry. The result? Escalation, instability on steroids. Fortunately, when you have renounced first use options, you enhance crisis stability, even if your adversary doesn't. China and India have had no first use policies from day one, i.e., since each of their first nuclear weapons tests. Despite intermittent speculation by others, they have consistently reiterated their commitment to it at the highest levels. This is a source of some embarrassment to other nuclear-armed states. By any objective standard, their policies have served them as well as any other first-use policies and at lower costs and risk. China has a no first-use agreement with neighboring Russia. India, on the other hand, is confronted with Pakistan's first-use policy. Despite several skirmishes, the fact that Pakistan doesn't have to worry about India attempting to preempt has been a stabilizing factor. For a new convert to no first use, it's simply not possible to instill such confidence overnight. To gain the benefits of your adversary finding your new stance trustworthy, other steps are advisable. The pledge is a crucial first step, but actions speak louder than words. For example, if anyone with a role in implementing nuclear policy speaks out positively or nostalgically about first-use options, they should be publicly reprimanded and removed from such position of authority. All military exercises that involve nuclear arms should be conducted transparently, so that any resort to nuclear force is specifically of an in-kind retaliatory basis and preferably de-escalatory in nature. Retaliatory options should not be instantaneous. They should allow time to properly assess the actual impact of a suspected nuclear escalation and whether it was by accident or unauthorized. If a nuclear weapon system cannot be de-alerted without making it vulnerable to preemption, then it should be eliminated. The proceeding can be done unilaterally. Readiness to engage in good faith negotiations of further bilateral and multilateral confidence building measures could lead to mutually beneficial arrangements. Speaking of good faith, if you retain first use options to counter conventional threats, then you are not ready to live in a nuclear weapon free world and are disinclined to negotiate in good faith to establish one. Likewise, negative security guarantees lack credibility when nuclear escalation versus a nuclear armed adversary is contemplated. After all, if one is willing to resort to nuclear attack in the face of likely in kind retaliation, how much easier would it be to use against a non nuclear weapon state? This undermines the nonproliferation regime. And if it's just a bluff, isn't bluffing, by its very nature, an act of bad faith? Namely, terrorizing those who don't know you're bluffing. Presidents Reagan and Gorbachev acknowledged mutual deterrence when they declared a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. But first use options flagrantly contradict that wisdom. On two occasions, the national representatives of 6 of the 9 nuclear armed states and many of their respective allies have declared the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons is inadmissible. This applies especially to any initiation of nuclear warfare. The security promise of nuclear deterrence is that it is the best means of preventing nuclear war. First use policies belie that promise. There has never been a proper public debate about first use policies. Given the flimsy, bluffing nature of first use plans, preparations, and threats, it's hardly surprising that debate has been eschewed to date. At NATO headquarters, no first use, NFU, is jokingly referred to as no fun. First use policies have degenerated into a dogma, making any questioning of it heretical. Such rigidity in the face of counterproductive dangers does NATO a disservice. Likewise, Russian nuclear escalation threats undermine its credibility generally. The sooner nuclear armed states can individually and collectively muster the courage and honesty to fundamentally review first use policies, the better. With public engagement, the outcome will most likely be the jettisoning of first use policies in favor of no first use options. It has been almost eight decades since the destruction of Nagasaki. Operators of the nuclear forces in East and West acknowledge that, on top of safety and security measures, it has also been sheer good luck that nuclear war has not broken out. Our odds of surviving the decade or two necessary to establish a nuclear weapon-free world would be greatly enhanced by the renunciation of all first-use options. While the current state of the world is not particularly conducive to multilateral progress, the advantages of focusing on use policy rather than weapons numbers is that unilateral action is directly beneficial regardless of whether reciprocation is immediately forthcoming. In summary, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, they say. Well, NATO's nuclear policy is broke and has been for over half a century. The time to fix it is now. Nothing is gained by procrastinating, especially when the war in Ukraine rages on. The absence of nuclear weapons use since Nagasaki proves only that all the major powers understand that nuclear escalation is a lose-lose proposition, and that even threatening such use is, as the G20 said, inadmissible. Instead of wishing that China and India would abandon their no first use policies, other nuclear armed states and alliances should follow their lead and reap the immediate security benefits. Until this occurs, talk of nuclear arms reduction leading to elimination is delusional. First use policies provoke arms racing and exacerbate crisis instability. Only when they are renounced will systematic and progressive efforts be made toward a nuclear weapon-free world. The NPT review process is an entirely appropriate venue for addressing this issue. The uncertain status of escalation dominance in the late 60s meant that neither Russia nor the US and the UK were keen to have nuclear weapons use policies linked to nonproliferations. The draft treaty those powers tabled at the 18-Nation Disarmament Conference, now the CD, contains zero action commitments on their part. Ultimately, they agreed to the goal of nuclear disarmament, but nothing more. Paradoxically, the failure to live up to disarmament obligations has served as a distraction from use policies. Only recently have non-nuclear weapon states and China begun to champion this point. Greater effort will inspire broad public support and yield significant results. Thank you for listening. Have a good session.